The mud on the shoreline of Lake Talvern was already churned red and brown when John Mercer stripped off his shirt and stepped into the ring of torches, and the crowd's noise dropped to nothing the moment he did, because everyone in Lake Holt knew he was not supposed to be there. "Where is Wolam?" The voice that cut through the hush belonged to an orc woman standing across the trampled circle, and it carried the flat, dangerous calm of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. She was tall enough to look down on most of the men gathered on the shore, built with the corded, coiled strength of a warrior who had spent her whole life earning every inch of muscle on her frame. Her green-gray skin gleaming faintly in the firelight, twin tusks curving up from her lower jaw, black hair bound back in a thick braid threaded with copper wire. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, dark and oiled, laced tight across a broad chest and a narrow waist, vambraces strapped to her forearms, and a wide belt that cinched her hips before the leather flared into thigh guards worn soft and supple from years of use. Every line of her was built for violence, and every line of her was also, John thought with an unwelcome lurch in his stomach, breathtaking. "Wolam broke his leg last night when your kin fired the granary," John said before he could stop himself. He hadn't meant to say your kin asterisk like an accusation, but it came out that way, and a low growl rippled through the orcs gathered along the far side of the ring. The woman's yellow eyes narrowed on him. "And you are his replacement, a fisherman." "John Mercer," he said, because it seemed important that she know his name before she put him in the mud. "And yes, a fisherman." "Karga Steeljaw," she said, as though the name alone should have made him turn and run. Around her, murmurs rose from the orc side of the shore. Champion. Never lost. Never even bled. On the human side, someone was praying under their breath, and Reeve Corwin Hale, the balding, sweating man who had all but shoved John into this ring an hour before, would not meet his eyes. John did not know much about orc custom, but he knew this much, because Hale had explained it to him in a desperate whisper as they walked down to the shore. When land was disputed between clan and village, and blood had already been spilled on both sides, the old law allowed for a trial of champions instead of a war. Whoever won the Narrows, the long, fish-rich stretch of shoreline that both Lake Holt and the Steeljaw clan claimed as their own, the strip of water that 3 men and 2 orcs had already died over in the raid 2 nights past. Grapple until one yielded or was thrown 3 times or the moon set. That was the whole of the law. Simple, brutal, and final. "You understand what happens if you lose," Karga said, circling into the mud, her boots sucking wet with each step. "I understand what happens if nobody tries," John said. He had fished this lake since he was a boy of 12, mending nets his father had mended before him, and he was not going to stand on the dock and watch the Narrows, the only shoal where the silverfin ran thick enough in autumn to feed the whole village, through winter get handed away by a broken leg and a coward's excuse. He rolled his shoulders. His hands, thick-knuckled and rope-scarred, curled at his sides. "Let's get on with it." Something flickered across Karga's face, surprise, maybe, or the ghost of respect, before she came at him. She was faster than her size should have allowed, and stronger than anything John had ever grappled with, including the storm 2 winters back that had nearly taken his boat and his life along with it. Her first grip closed around his forearm like a winch chain, and she used his own momentum to try to throw him into the mud within 3 seconds of the match beginning. But 3 seconds was long enough for 20 years of hauling nets in a pitching boat to matter. John dropped his weight the way he dropped it when a net tried to drag him over the rail, twisted with the throw instead of against it, and instead of landing on his back, he landed rolling, came up with mud to his elbows, and got a fistful of her belt before she could set her feet again. The crowd made a sound like a held breath finally released. They grappled for what felt like an hour and was probably 3 minutes, orc strength against fisherman stubbornness, her raw power against the strange, patient leverage of a man who had spent his whole life fighting things heavier than himself: nets, ropes, the lake in a temper. Twice she threw him. Twice he did not stay down, hauling himself up on a fistful of her leather harness, which made her bare her tusks in something that was almost, impossibly, a smile. Once he nearly had her, hooking a leg behind her knee the way he'd learned wrestling drunk sailors at the docks, and for one heartbeat her balance wavered, but she caught herself on his shoulder, and the two of them went down together, into the shallows where the lake met the churned shore, and came up soaked to the skin, still locked together, still neither one yielding, until the old orc elder standing at the edge of the torchlight raised a horn and blew a long, cracked note that meant the moon had set and the trial was done. Silence, then chaos, both sides shouting at once, arguing about what a draw even meant, because in living memory no trial of champions had ever ended without a winner. Karga Steeljaw stood in the shallows, lake water sluicing off her leathers, chest heaving, staring at John Mercer as if he had grown a second head. "No one has matched me," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it over the shouting. "Not once. Not ever." "Well," John said, wringing water out of his sleeve, "there's a first for everything, I suppose." Her eyes were still on him, bright and startled, and something else beneath the startlement, something hungrier. "I want a rematch," she said. "Now, tonight." Karga, an older orc male, broad as a barn door with gray streaking his tusks, pushed through the crowd toward her, his hand closing on her shoulder. "The trial is done. The elders will decide what a draw means." "Then let them decide," Karga said, not taking her eyes off John, "while I finish this." "You cannot finish it tonight," the old orc said. "The law says once." Her jaw worked. John watched her fight down whatever pride was roaring inside her, watched her lose that fight and win it in the same breath, forcing her shoulders to unclench by will alone. It was, he thought, the most human thing he had ever seen anyone do, and she was not human at all. "Then I will have my rematch," she said, loud enough now for both shores to hear. "When the elders are done deciding, I am Karga Steeljaw. I do not leave a thing unfinished." Her gaze flicked once more to John, sharp as a fishhook catching light. "Not this. Not you, fisherman." She turned and strode up the bank into the dark before he could find an answer, and John Mercer stood alone in the shallows of Lake Talvern, dripping, bruised, and entirely certain that his quiet life had just ended. The elders, 3 gray-bearded men from Lake Holt and 3 grizzled orcs from the Steeljaw camp, argued for 2 days before they reached the only decision that made any of them happy, which was to say, a decision that made none of them happy. The draw stood. Neither side would take the Narrows outright. Instead, for the span of 1 full moon, the 2 champions, Karga Steeljaw and John Mercer, would serve together as go-betweens, hammering out a shared use of the shoreline before blood spilled again. Reeve Hale delivered this news to John on his own dock, where he was mending a net with hands that still ached from the grappling, and John very nearly threw the man into the lake. "I am not a diplomat," John said. "I gut fish for a living, Corwin." "You're the only man in this village who managed not to lose to her," Hale said. "That makes you the only man she'll speak to without spitting first. Please, John. There's already talk of raising a militia on our side, and I hear the clan's got its own hotheads baying for the same. If this falls apart, it won't just be the Narrows we lose. It'll be the whole shore and half of us with it." So it was that John Mercer found himself, 3 mornings later, walking the muddy track up from the village toward the low hills where the Steeljaw war camp sprawled in a wide half-circle of hide tents and cook fires, carrying nothing but a walking stick and a knot of dread in his stomach, because he had heard the stories same as anyone orcs raiding border farms a generation back, human soldiers burning a Steeljaw winter camp before that. 100 years of grudges passed down like heirlooms on both sides of the water. He did not expect to be welcomed. He did not expect either for Karga Steeljaw to be standing at the edge of the camp waiting for him, arms crossed over her leather-bound chest, tusks catching the morning light. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite surprise and not quite approval but close kin to both. "Said I would." He stopped a respectful distance away, aware of the dozens of eyes on him from the tents beyond, warriors sharpening blades, A woman grinding grain, children who stared at him like he was some strange fish washed up on their shore. Didn't seem right to let you think a fisherman's word was worth less than a warrior's. Something shifted in her face. "Come," she said. "Walk with me. My father wants words with the human who would not fall down." Her father, it turned out, was Chieftain Karga Steeljaw, a mountain of an orc gone gray at the temples, who studied John for a long, silent minute across the low fire in his tent before grunting something that might have been approval and might have been indigestion. "My daughter has not asked for anything twice in her life," he said, in halting but clear village tongue. "She has never had to. She wins or she takes what she wants some other way. You put a crack in that. I am curious what grows out of a crack." "With respect, chieftain," John said, "I didn't put a crack in anything. I just didn't fall down." Karga Steeljaw's laugh was like a rock slide. "That," he said, "is exactly the crack I mean." The first weeks of the truce were not romance. They were long, exhausting days of walking the disputed shoreline with Karga at his side, arguing over fishing rights and drying racks and whose nets could be cast where, translating village stubbornness to clan pride and back again, until John's head ached worse than his bruised ribs. But somewhere in the walking, in the arguing, in the long silences between, something began to shift. Karga did not speak like the raiders in the stories John had grown up fearing. She spoke of her clans dead with the same rough grief John felt for the men lost the night the granary burned. She laughed rare and low and startling every time at the sight of John, nearly pitching off a rock trying to show her how a gillnet worked, and she caught his arm before he could fall in, her grip like iron in her palm, for one strange moment, warm and careful against his skin. "You are the strangest human I have met," she told him one evening as they sat on a driftwood log at the edge of the Narrows, watching the sun bleed orange across the water. "You have no army behind you, no great house. You smell of fish." "High praise," John said dryly. "It is," she said and meant it, turning to look at him with an intensity that made his chest go tight. "Every man who has ever wanted me wanted my father's favor or my clan's strength or my name to raise over his own. You want none of that. You want only that no one burns your boats." She tilted her head, tusks gleaming. "It is refreshing." "I want more than my boats not burning," John said before he thought better of it, and her eyes sharpened on him with sudden, dangerous interest. "Do you?" she said, not a question, an invitation. He did not answer, because he did not trust his own voice not to shake, and she let the silence stretch, watching him with a small, satisfied curl at the corner of her mouth, as if she had already decided something and was only waiting for him to catch up. It was around then that Dragov started circling. Dragov Ironfang was a broad-shouldered warrior, a decade older than Karga, scarred across one cheek from some old border skirmish. And he had, by every account John heard whispered around the camp, been pressing his suit for Karga's hand for 3 winters running. A formal courtship by clan law, sealed with challenge fights he had won against every rival who dared step forward, until there had been no rivals left to step forward at all. He watched John now with the flat, assessing stare of a man, measuring a threat he had not expected to need to measure. "The fish gutter thinks himself clan business," Dragov said one afternoon, loud enough to carry across the cook fires, when John came to fetch Karga for another day of shoreline negotiations. "Perhaps he forgets he is a guest here. Guests do not walk beside the champion as though they have earned the right." "I have not asked you what I have earned, Dragov," Karga said, not turning from where she was checking the edge of her blade. "You are not the one who decides it. Your father might decide it differently if he thought you meant to shame the clan over a man who smells of the lake bottom." John kept his voice level, though his pulse was not. "I've no wish to shame anyone. I'm here because the village asked it of me, same as Karga's here because her clan asked it of her." Dragov's gaze slid to him, contemptuous. "The village asked a man who could not even win his own trial." "Nor lost it," John said. For a moment Dragov's hand drifted toward the long knife at his hip, and the air went taut as a hauled net, but Karga rose then, unhurried, and stepped between them without seeming to hurry at all, and the sheer, casual certainty of her presence was enough to make Dragoff's hand fall still. "Walk away, Dragoff," she said, quiet and final, "before I remind you why no one has beaten me either." He walked away. But he did not stop watching, and John did not stop feeling the weight of that stare on the back of his neck for days after. The nights, at least, belonged to no one else. It became a habit neither of them named Karga, finding her way down to the dock where John kept his boat, long after the village had gone dark and quiet, to sit with him on the weathered planks while the lake breathed slow and black beneath them. She asked him about fishing, about storms, about the small, unremarkable life he had built for himself on this shore, and he found himself telling her things he had never bothered telling anyone, because no one had ever asked in a way that made him feel like the answer mattered. She asked why he had never married, and he told her honestly that no one in Lake had ever looked at a quiet fisherman with empty pockets and seen anything worth staying for. "Then Lake is full of fools," Karga said, so simply that it knocked the breath half out of him. "And what do the Steeljaw clan see when they look at their champion?" he asked. "Someone unbeatable, untouchable. Does anyone ever just see you?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought he had overstepped, until she said low, "No. Not until you did not fall down in the mud and looked at me after like I was a person instead of a prize to be won." She turned to him on the dock, closer than she had ever sat before, her knee brushing his. "I have fought 100 men, John Mercer. I have never once wanted to lose to one. I'm not sure I want to win against you either." "That a proposal?" he asked, half a joke and entirely not. "It is a warning," she said, and closed the last inch of distance between them and kissed him. It was not gentle. There was nothing gentle in the way her hand fisted in his shirt or the low, hungry sound she made against his mouth. And John Mercer, who had spent a lifetime being overlooked, being the quiet man at the edge of every gathering, the fisherman nobody chose first, found himself being chosen, fiercely, deliberately, by a woman who could have had any warrior in her clan and wanted instead him. He kissed her back with everything he had been too afraid to say out loud, and when she finally pulled back, breathless, her tusked grin was fierce and bright in the moonlight. "I will still have my rematch," she said against his mouth. "I never doubted it," he said, and kissed her again. The treaty feast was meant to be the last, best proof that peace could hold. A night when both sides sat under one roof, in the long hall at the center of Lake Holt, human and orc shoulder to shoulder over trestle tables loaded with roasted lake trout and dark clan bread, to seal in words what John and Karga had spent a month sealing in shared work and shared silences. Reeve Hale had practically begged John to stand at the head table beside Karga, as living proof the truce had teeth. John had agreed, though something in his gut had been uneasy all day, a fisherman's instinct for weather that had nothing to do with the sky. The hall was loud and warm, and for the first hour, almost joyful old rivalries thawing under shared ale. A Steeljaw drummer teaching a knot of village boys a war rhythm on an overturned barrel, Karga laughing at John's side with her hand resting, unhidden and unashamed, on his arm for anyone to see. It was, John thought, the first time in his life he had ever felt like the center of a room instead of its shadow. Then Dragoff stood up. He had been drinking since before the feast began, and the drink had not softened him. It had stripped away whatever thin patience he had left. He rose from his bench at the far end of the hall, swaying, his scarred face twisted, and John saw his hand close around the hilt of a long knife hidden beneath his belt a half-second before he understood what was happening. "You would let a fish gutter sit at the champion's side," Dragoff snarled, in the clan tongue and then again in village speech, so both halves of the hall would understand. "You would let him take what warriors have died to earn. My cousin burned in that granary fire because of border blood. He poisoned with his presence." John was nowhere near the granary that night, Karga snapped, rising, but Dragoff was already moving, shoving past the table, the knife coming free of his belt in a flash of firelight, and he was not lunging at Karga at all. He was lunging past her, straight at John, blade low and murderous, 3 strides and closing. John had no time to think. He had time only to see the knife and know, with terrible clarity, that he was not going to be fast enough to get out of its way. Karga moved faster than anything John had ever seen a living thing move. She did not shout a warning. She threw herself sideways into the gap between them, putting her own body between John Mercer and Dragoff's blade, and the knife that had been meant for John's throat instead opened a long, shallow line of fire across her ribs and up her forearm as she caught the blow on herself rather than let it reach him. The hall exploded into screaming. John did not remember deciding to move. One moment he was frozen, and the next his hands were on Dragoff, hauling the bigger man's knife arm wide and down, using every hard year of hauling storm lines and dead weight out of a pitching boat, slamming Dragoff's wrist against the trestle table hard enough that the knife clattered free and skittered across the floorboards. Village men and clan warriors were already surging in from every side, dragging Dragoff back, pinning his arms, and through the roar of it John had eyes for only one thing: Karga, on her knees on the floor of the hall, blood soaking dark through her leathers, her hand pressed to her ribs, her face white with pain, but her eyes, when they found his, fierce and clear and entirely unafraid. Karga, he was on the floor beside her before he knew he'd moved, hands hovering, terrified to touch the wound and terrified not to. Why would you? Because you would have died, she said, through her teeth, and I decided a long time ago that was not a thing I would allow. You could have died instead. I have taken worse than this from better fighters than Dragoff, she said, though her voice shook faintly on the last word, betraying the lie in worse than this. Stop looking at me like I am made of glass, fisherman, and help me stand before I bleed on this floor in front of my father. He helped her stand. Around them the hall had gone to chaos, and then, slowly, to grim order. Chieftain Karga Steeljaw himself had waded through the crowd, his face a thundercloud, and 4 of his warriors had Dragoff on his knees, disarmed and shaking, no longer drunk brave but simply drunk and afraid. Ruck looked at his daughter's bleeding side, and then at John Mercer's hand still hovering protectively near her, and something passed over the old chieftain's face that was not quite approval but was not far from it either. "Take him to the holding tent," Ruck said, of Dragoff, his voice flat with a fury too large for shouting. "He will answer for this before the whole clan by our law, not by a knife in a crowded hall like a coward." Dragoff was dragged away, still protesting that he had only meant to defend the clan's honor, that a human had no right. His voice faded into the night, and the hall was left with overturned benches, spilled ale, and a silence thick enough to choke on. John carried Karga to the healer's tent himself, refusing every offer of help along the way, her weight solid and real against his chest, her blood warm against his forearm where he cradled her, and he did not put her down until the old clan healer, a stooped orc woman with clever, careful hands, ordered him to. He sat outside the tent afterward for the better part of an hour, until the healer emerged and told him, not unkindly, that the wound was shallow, that the champion would carry a scar and nothing worse, and that she was asking for him by name. He went in to find Karga sitting up on a pallet of furs, her side bound tight in clean linen, glaring at the healer's insistence that she rest. "You threw yourself in front of a knife for me," John said, kneeling beside the pallet, his voice rough with everything he had been holding down since the hall. "I did," Karga said, unrepentant. "You're the strongest fighter I've ever seen." "You didn't need to. I did not do it because I needed to," she said, catching his hand in hers, her grip fierce, even wounded, even tired. "I did it because I could not have lived with watching you die when it was in my power to stop it. Do you understand the difference, John Mercer?" Her eyes, gold in the lamplight, held his without flinching. "I have never once in all my life put myself between another person and a blade, not for my clan, not for my father. There has never been anyone I loved enough to make that choice easy." Her thumb traced slow, deliberate circles over his knuckles. It was easy tonight. He kissed her then, careful of her wound, one hand cradling her jaw, and she made a soft sound against his mouth that had nothing to do with pain, her uninjured arm coming up to pull him closer. And for a long while neither of them spoke at all, because there was nothing left to say that their hands and mouths were not already saying better. "I want you," she murmured against his throat later when the lamp had burned low and the tent was quiet around them. "Not as a truce, not as a treaty, as mine, John Mercer, in the old way of my people, if you will have it, and I do not ask that lightly because I have never asked it of anyone. I've never been anyone's first choice for anything in my life," John said, his voice unsteady. "You could have any warrior in your clan. Any man in the village would trade his boat to stand where I'm standing right now. I do not want any warrior in my clan," Karga said, fierce and low. "I do not want any man in your village. I have fought and beaten every rival worth beating, John, and won every honor my people have to give, and none of it ever felt like this, like something I would bleed for gladly, like something worth keeping." She pressed her forehead to his. "Choose me back and mean it, and I am yours until the lake runs dry." "I mean it," John said. "I've meant it since you didn't let go of my arm in the mud." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it, and when they finally drew apart, breathless, her tusked smile was soft in a way he suspected very few people had ever seen. "Good," she said, "because I still intend to collect my rematch." He laughed low and disbelieving, his forehead against hers. "After a knife fight and a love confession, you're thinking about wrestling." "I am Karga Steeljaw," she said, entirely serious, entirely herself. "I think of very little else." The trial for Dragov Ironfang was held 3 days later, beneath the open sky at the edge of the war camp. Before every warrior and elder the Steeljaw clan could gather, and John stood at the circle's edge because Karga had asked him to be there, though he was not permitted to speak, not being clan. Dragov knelt in the dirt, stripped of the ceremonial braid that marked a warrior's standing, and Chieftain Ruck pronounced the charge in a voice like grinding stone, drawing a blade in a hall of peace against the terms of the truce in an attempt to murder a guest under clan protection. "Clan law gives you a choice," Ruck said. "Exile beyond the border stones, never to return, or trial by combat against the one you wronged in spirit if she will grant it." Every eye in the circle turned to Karga. She stepped forward, her wound still bound tight beneath her leathers, her chin high. "I will grant it," she said, "not for the blade you tried to put in my mate's throat. For every year you thought my hand was a thing to be won like a duel instead of given like a gift." Dragov's face, when he looked up, was not defiant anymore, only tired, and old, and finally, fully beaten in a way no blade had managed. "I yield," he said, hoarse. "I have no wish to feel your grip again, champion. Exile, then. I will take exile." It was done quickly after that, the ritual words, the breaking of his warrior's braid before the whole camp, the long walk to the border stones with 2 warriors to see him pass them. John watched Karga's shoulders unknot inch by inch as the gate of hide and rope closed behind Dragov Ironfang for the last time, and when she turned back to the circle, to her father, to the clan, there was something new and unburdened in the way she held herself. "It is done," Ruck Steeljaw said to the gathered clan, and then in village speech, so John would understand it too, and the shame of it does not fall on the human who bled for nothing he asked for. It falls on us, for letting jealousy wear a warrior's face too long unchecked. He looked to John then, and inclined his great gray head, the closest thing to a bow John had ever seen the old chieftain give anyone. "You have my thanks, fisherman, for the steadiness you showed my daughter when it counted. She's the one who bled for me, chieftain," John said. "Any thanks belongs to her." Ruck's laugh rumbled out again, softer this time. "That," he said, "is why she chose you. Most men would have claimed the credit." With Dragov gone and the clan's temper settled, the last weeks of the truce moved faster than any of them expected. Elders from both sides, no longer distracted by fear of a war restarting, hammered out the terms of the Narrows in a handful of long, argumentative, but ultimately good-natured meetings. A shared shoreline, human nets in the shallows through the autumn run, Steeljaw spearfishers working the deep channel in spring, a treaty stone to be raised at the boundary marking the agreement in both tongues. John and Karga stood together at every meeting, no longer merely go-betweens forced together by law, but partners in every sense that mattered. And slowly, cautiously, the village of Lake began to see what the clan camp had already come to understand, that their fisherman and the orc champion were bound to each other in a way neither law nor land dispute had created, and neither law nor land dispute was going to unmake. Not everyone in the village came around easily. There were mutters at the well, and one old woman who spat at Karga's shadow in the market square before Reeve Hale, red-faced and furious, threatened to have her thrown out of Lake for it. There was a fisherman named Tobias Wren, a longtime rival of John's for dock space and pride alike, who made loud comments in the tavern about a man who'd let an orc put her claim on him like a prize bull, and who found himself, one evening, staring down the full weight of Karga Steeljaw's unimpressed glare across a crowded room until he decided his ale was more interesting than his own opinions. But for every mutter, there were more villagers who remembered whose blood had been spilled to keep the peace, whose steady hand had kept two proud, wounded peoples from tearing the shoreline apart in grief and rage. And Karga Steeljaw's name, once a thing to fear, became instead a thing spoken with something closer to respect, even gratitude, especially among the fishing families whose autumn catch had been saved by the treaty she and John had built. On the morning the treaty stone was raised at the boundary of the Narrows, a great gray slab hauled by 6 men and 2 orc warriors, carved on one face with village script and on the other with clan glyphs. The words different but the meaning, everyone agreed, exactly the same. The whole shoreline gathered to watch it settle into the earth. It was a bright, cold morning, the lake flat and silver as a blade, and when the stone was set and the crowd's cheer had died into satisfied murmuring, Karga turned to John in front of the whole gathering, human and orc both, and said, loudly enough to carry, "I believe there is still a matter unsettled between us, fishermen." John's stomach dropped pleasantly. "Is there?" "A rematch," she said, and her grin was fierce and bright and entirely without shame. "Long promised, long overdue. I do not leave things unfinished, John Mercer. I told you that the very first night." A ripple of laughter and excited chatter went through the crowd. Word had gone around the whole shore by now. The story of the champion who'd been matched to a draw and the fisherman who wouldn't fall down, and everyone, it seemed, wanted to see how it ended. "Here?" John asked. "Now, is there a better place," Karga said, "than the very shore we nearly bled a war over on the day it became something worth keeping instead?" So the ring was drawn again in the mud at the water's edge, torches unnecessary under the bright morning sun, and this time there was no dread in the crowd's hush, only anticipation, villagers and clanfolk alike pressing close along the shoreline to watch. Karga stripped off her outer vambraces, rolling her shoulders, her braids swinging loose down her back, and John rolled up his sleeves, feeling every eye on him and, for once in his life, not minding it at all, because the woman across the ring from him was looking at him like he was the only thing worth looking at on the whole wide lake. "No knives this time," John said. "There were never knives meant for this ring," she said. "Only for cowards who could not stand in it. Rules, the same as before. Grapple until one yields or is thrown 3 times, or," she nodded at the sky, at the sun instead of the moon, "until noon if you'd rather not wait for the dark to hide your bruises." "I'll take my chances in daylight," John said, and stepped into the ring. This time, he thought, watching her circle him, unhurried, hungry, delighted. This time there was no fear in it at all, on either side. Only the pure, joyful challenge of 2 people who had already given each other everything that mattered, meeting now simply because they both wanted to. She came at him fast, as she had the first night, and he met her the way he'd learned to meet the lake, in a temper, giving ground where giving ground served him, rooting his feet where rooting served him better. and the crowd roared and gasped by turns as they grappled through the mud, both of them laughing now, unable entirely to help it, her tusked grin flashing every time he found a hold that surprised her. His own broad grin answering every time she used some trick of leverage to nearly put him on his back. In the end, it was not a draw. She threw him a third time cleanly into the shallow water at the ring's edge, and stood over him with her hand extended, breathing hard, soaked with mud and lake water and sunlight, more beautiful than anything John Mercer had ever hoped to have in his life. "I win," she said. "You do," he agreed, taking her offered hand and letting her haul him up, and he did not care in the slightest, because the prize for losing turned out to be her mouth on his in front of the whole gathered shore, unhurried and utterly unashamed, while both peoples who had nearly gone to war over this same stretch of mud cheered loud enough to carry clear across the water. "I told you," she murmured against his lips when the noise finally settled, "I do not leave things unfinished." "And now," he asked, "is it finished?" "No," Karga said, drawing back just far enough to look at him properly, her eyes bright, her hand finding his and lacing their fingers together, unhesitating in front of her father, in front of the village, in front of everyone who had ever doubted either of them belonged where they now so plainly stood. "Now, John Mercer, it is only beginning." That evening, as the crowd dispersed back toward the village and the war camp both, laughing and talking of the match already being reshaped into legend, Karga walked with John along the shore to the small, weathered cottage at the edge of the docks that had been his alone for a decade, its single window golden with lamplight, its worn threshold silvered by years of salt wind and rain. She stopped there at the doorstep, and did not step through, though he could see in her eyes that she wanted to. "There is a custom among my people," she said, quiet now, serious in a way she rarely let herself be, even with him. "When a warrior chooses a mate, she does not simply take him. She stands at his door and she asks to be let in, not as a champion, not as anyone's daughter, but as herself, plainly, with nothing to hide behind. And if he opens the door to her freely, it is done. There is no undoing it after, not by clan law, not by anything." "That's a heavy door to open," John said, though his voice was thick with feeling, not hesitation. "It is," Karga agreed. "So I will ask you plainly, fisherman, with the whole lake at my back and nothing hidden. I am Karga Steeljaw. I have no crown to offer you, no fortune, only my strength, my loyalty, and a heart I have never once given to anyone before you cracked it open in the mud on the worst night of my life. Will you have me, not as a truce, not as a treaty, as yours the way I already think of you as mine?" John's throat was too tight for a moment to answer at all. He thought of every year he had stood at the edge of every gathering in Lake Holt, overlooked, unremarkable, a quiet man with rope-scarred hands, and a boat that was falling apart at the seams. And he thought of this woman, fierce enough to frighten armies, tender enough to bleed for a fisherman nobody else had ever bothered to see, standing at his threshold asking, as though the answer were not already written plain across both their faces. "I've spent my whole life being the man nobody chose first," he said, low and rough. "I don't have anything grand to give you either, Karga, just this cottage and this lake and every day I've got left in me. That," she said, "is everything I want." "Then yes," John said. "Come in, stay. I choose you, I'll go on choosing you every morning I wake up next to you for as long as you'll have me." He opened the door and she stepped through it, and the threshold of his small, weathered cottage became, in that one unhurried motion, something neither of them would ever again call merely his. She kissed him there in the doorway, slow and sure and unafraid, her hands framing his face with a gentleness that startled him every time he remembered how easily those same hands could break a man in half. And when at last they drew back to breathe, her forehead resting against his, the lake beyond the open door glittering gold with the last of the sunset, she laughed soft and warm and entirely unguarded. "My father will want a proper clan binding, eventually," she said. "Braided cords, an exchange of blades, the whole noisy business. My clan does not do quiet things quietly." "I wouldn't expect anything less," John said, smiling against her hair. "But that is for another season," Karga said, drawing him back inside, pulling the door shut behind them both with a decisive, unhurried hand. "Tonight, I only wanted the doorway." Word of the champions' rematch, and of what had followed it, spread up and down the shore of Lake Talvern faster than any treaty stone could have carried it alone. Fishermen mending nets on the docks told it to traders passing through, who carried it to villages further down the water, until the tale of the fisherman who would not fall down, and the orc champion who threw herself in front of a blade for him, and demanded her rematch not out of wounded pride, but out of a heart she had never let anyone near before, became something closer to a local legend than a piece of ordinary gossip. Children on the Lake Holt docks took to play wrestling in the mud at low tide, shouting Karga's name and John's in equal measure, and more than one old grudge between village and clan softened, quietly, in the shadow of a story everyone agreed was, whatever else it was, a good one. Karga did not abandon her place among the Steeljaw clan, nor did John abandon his boat and his nets, and neither of them ever pretended their two worlds had become one seamless thing overnight. There were still hard conversations about where they would live, about how a clan champion balanced her duties to her father's people against a life built on a human dock, about the villagers who needed more time than others to unclench at the sight of an orc woman walking freely among their homes. But Karga met every hard conversation the way she met everything else, without flinching, and John met it the same way he had always met the lake, in a temper, patiently, steadily, refusing to be moved by fear alone. Chieftain Ruck, for his part, declared that his daughter's mate would always have a place at the clan's fire, and made certain every warrior under his command understood that the fisherman who had bled figuratively, and very nearly literally, for the peace between their peoples was to be treated with the respect due kin, not the wary suspicion due a stranger. In the end, it was the villagers of Lake Holt who surprised everyone most. When autumn came and the Silverfin run began, thick and silver-bright in the shallows of the Narrows, exactly as the treaty had promised, human boats and clan spearfishers worked the water side by side without incident for the first time in a generation, and more than one grudging old fisherman found himself grateful, whatever his private feelings about orcs in general, for a shoreline no longer soaked in blood. On the evening the first full catch came in, the village threw together a modest feast on the docks, nothing so grand as the treaty feast that had nearly ended in tragedy, just tables dragged out into the open air, lanterns strung along the pilings, and both peoples mingling with a wary but real goodwill that would have seemed impossible only a season before. Karga stood at the end of the longest dock that evening, watching the lanterns reflect gold and trembling across the dark water, and John came to stand beside her the way he had 100 times now, close enough that their shoulders touched, easy and unhurried. "You are thinking of something," he said. "I am thinking," she said, "that I have won every honor my clan has to give, champion, unbeaten in every trial, my father's pride, my people's respect." She turned to look at him, and there was nothing guarded left in her face at all, nothing of the fierce, untouchable warrior who had stood across a torchlit ring from him a season ago and demanded a rematch out of wounded pride. None of it ever felt like this. Like standing on a dock at the edge of the water I once nearly went to war over, with the only person I have ever truly wanted beside me, and knowing there is nothing left to prove to anyone, because I have already won the only prize that ever mattered. "That's not a bad speech," John said, "for a woman who once told me she thinks of very little besides wrestling." Her laugh rang out over the water, bright and unguarded, and she pulled him close by the front of his shirt, the same way she had that first night on the dock when the world had still felt uncertain between them. "I still intend to beat you again someday," she said. "Do not think this softens me toward mercy in the ring." "I wouldn't dream of expecting mercy from you," John said. "Not in the ring, not anywhere. It's one of the things I love best about you." "Good," Karga said, "because I have no intention of changing fishermen." only of loving you exactly as fiercely as I do everything else." She kissed him then, unhurried, sure, with the whole lantern-lit dock and both their peoples close enough to see and no longer minding that they did. And beneath their feet the dark water of Lake Talvern rocked the pilings gently, patient and endless. The same water that had nearly torn two peoples apart and had instead, against every hard old grudge and every hard old fear, given them each other. Later, long after the feast had wound down and the lanterns had burned low, they walked back along the shoreline together toward the small cottage that was no longer only his, past the great gray treaty stone standing silent sentinel at the border of the Narrows, its two faces of script and glyph catching the last of the moonlight. Karga paused there, resting her hand against the cool stone, and John stopped beside her, waiting, the way he had learned to wait for her these past months, not with impatience, but with the quiet certainty that whatever she needed to say, she would say it when she was ready, and it would be worth the waiting. "I never asked for a rematch before you," she said at last, quietly, more to the stone and the water than to him, though he knew the words were meant for him all the same. "Not once in all my years as champion. I never needed to. I always won the first time every time, and there was never anything in the losing or the winning that made me want to reach for it twice." She turned to him, moonlight silvering the sharp planes of her face, softening nothing of her strength, and yet somehow making her look in that moment entirely unguarded. "You are the only thing I have ever wanted a second chance at, John Mercer. The only thing I have ever asked for immediately, without pride standing in the way, because some part of me already knew, that very first night in the mud, that I could not let you go without knowing what it would be to hold you." "You didn't have to ask twice," John said, his voice rough with everything he felt and had no better words for. "You'd already won before you ever asked. I think some part of me knew that too, the moment you didn't let go of my arm." "Then we are both fools," Karga said, "who fell in love in the mud over a fishing shore in front of two peoples who wanted to kill each other." "Good kind of fool to be," John said. "The very best kind," she agreed, and drew him into her arms there beside the treaty stone, beneath the wide dark sky and the bright scatter of stars over Lake Talvern, and kissed him with all the fierce, unguarded devotion of a woman who had once feared nothing in this world, except the possibility of losing the one thing she had never known how to ask for, until he had given her no choice but to want it. They were married bound, in the old way of the Steeljaw clan, with braided cords exchanged at dawn on the shore of the Narrows. Her father's blessing rumbled out over both peoples gathered to witness it, and a simpler vow spoken after, in village custom, before Reeve Hale himself, before the following spring's silverfin run came in. Karga kept her place among her clan and made a new one, unshaken and unafraid, among the docks and cottages of Lake Holt. And John Mercer, once the quiet, overlooked fisherman nobody had thought to choose first, became, in the eyes of both the village and the clan, the steady, beloved center of a peace neither people had believed possible a year before. He never did beat her in the ring again, not properly. She made certain of that, laughing, every single time she pinned him. But he had long since stopped minding losing, because every loss ended the same way. In her arms, on their shore, chosen, wanted, and entirely, unshakably loved.